So, yeah, so welcome to this meeting in our special interest groups on post-normal science. Yeah, and this time we have the privilege of having one of the very influential post-normal scientists, namely Silvio Funtowicz, and not to do something stupid, I will let it be up to you, Silvio, to highlight which merits that you will highlight for us. But I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone that it's truly an honor and a privilege to have you speak today. So great.
Yes.
So please.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Katinka. Thank you, Lorenzo, for organizing this group and also for the invitation. Okay, I prepared something which is I don't usually do, but I think for this occasion. So later, if people are interested, I can send it a presentation and. Well, perhaps most of you know about post-normal science and know about my work with Jerry Rabbits. I don't think I have to say anything more, but when I say we, I mean Jerry and myself, okay? And we have been working together since the late 70s. On Monday evening, Jerry, who is 93, yes, had a lecture in the US online, and I participated. And he's as you know, Paul Simon used to say, still crazy after all these years. So it's always a pleasure to continue to work with him and an honor. Okay, now I prepared something, and as I said, I'll try to do something fast or as fast as possible without disturbing, and so we can have later a conversation. Okay, here it's me, and what you know, what I want to talk today is about how in the last couple of years, since we started with the pandemics, the COVID pandemics, there was like a new interest in post-normal science. And coming from places where it had never reached before. Okay, so I'm going to ask some questions and say why, and then come back to post-normal science, okay? So why is there interest? And we have been with Jerry really flooded with requests of podcasts, webinars, and participation in conference, and so on and so forth. Now, this is the title of my presentation, and it is based on, I took the title from an interview in a very important daily in Italy, probably the second or the first, and that's Corriere della Sera. And there is an immunologist, for those who don't read Italian, saying that science has to apologize to the Italian people because it was not able to speak with one voice. Okay, so so I picked that as the title of the presentation. And what were the questions that I was asked and we were asked about this? Well, the first is, can science speak with one voice? And the second, should science speak with one voice? Okay, now, a second illustration is from David Spiegelhalter. Perhaps you know about him. He's quite famous, and you can see his credential. Okay, so here what you see is also an interview quite in September 21, where Spiegelhalter, well, almost answers the immunologist question by saying that there are different ideas or advice that you can get from science. And he thinks that the phrase that many administrators and government use, that follow the science, is totally wrong. And also because it argues that if you know the science, you know what to do. Okay, so the question I was asked is, well, if I know the science, can I tell you what to do? If we know the science, can we tell what to do? So that's the second element here. The third is from a person that probably you are very familiar with, John Ioannidis, and independently of his position on COVID, this is an article again from September 2021, where he argued that the COVID has changed or is changing the norms of science. Okay, so that's independent of the position he has and on the subject, which was very much debated. But substantially, what he argues is that really the pandemic is changing the norms of science. Now, perhaps some of you are not familiar with this idea of the norms of science, and it actually comes from Robert Merton, you know, what's called the norms of science, and it is known by the acronym of KUDOS. And here you have them: communality, universalism, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism. Okay, but what is important here is not only this is what it considered the ethos of science, but you see, this is from a paper he wrote in 1942. Okay, and already the title is saying a lot: A Note on Science and Technology in a Democratic Order. And 1942, we are in the middle of the Second World War. And when it's important for you to see is, or to be aware, is that science not only participated practically in the military effort, and I think many of you can cite how, okay? It's not only the nuclear bomb, but also Turing, okay? And the beginning of cryptography. Also, for Neumann and Wiener developing queuing theory, and it was later as operational research for the transportation of goods and soldiers from North America to occupied Europe. Okay, so those are just a few examples of the practical way in which science contributed to the world effort, but also science intervened also in the ideological battle. Okay, and this is very important. And Merton and another person that is surely familiar to you, like Karl Popper, they both argue that science can only be done in a liberal democracy. Okay, and so they were giving examples of how science and technology are corrupted in authoritarian regimes like German, Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia. If you are interested, we can come back. Okay, now what happened? So my argument is that Ioannidis is wrong, because it was not COVID that changed the norms of science. The norms of science, the Mertonian norms, the ethos of science, has been changing for a long time. And here is a paper by Jan Mitrov, quite famous paper, where he interviewed the experts and scientists, engineers at NASA. Okay, and what he found is that instead of the Mertonian norm, the kudos, he found for each of them precisely the opposite. And that was a solitary effort, particular effort, interest, and organized dogmatism. Okay, so and there are many other examples, but in principle, the question is, what happened? How is it possible that from the idea of Merton about the norms that define science inside a liberal democracy, you have 30 years after precisely the opposite in the big scientific and technological efforts. Okay, now my explanation to that is this, and it has to do with perhaps also you're familiar with the report called Science, the Endless Frontier, that was done by Vannevar Bush, who was science advisor to the president of the US, and you see the date 1945, immediately after the war. And what Vannevar Bush did and what he advised, and it was implemented in the US, is the strong relation between science, technology, and the economy, employment, and growth. So before, although science and technology participated in the economy, it was not so clearly defined like in this report, which was implemented, and the result was an incredible growth in the scientific endeavor. Very much linked, as I say, to the economy and growth. So if I have to answer what happened between 42 and the 70s, is precisely growth. Now, here, just to give you an example, what I mean, is a book quite famous, 1963, by Derek Price, which called Little Science, Big Science, and Beyond. The term big science was coined by Erwin Weinberg. I put the reference on the site because I'll come back to Weinberg soon. But substantially, what Derek Price saw is this exponential growth in science, in the scientific effort. And thus, he argued that that created problems in the quality assurance of science. Now, we can come back to that, but just to hint what was the issue, you know, before the war, the Second World War, with most of the scientific effort was done in Europe, you know, all the scientists in one discipline knew each other. Okay, and so therefore it was not necessary to have a formal system of what we call today peer review, but in general of quality assurance, because everybody knew who was doing good work. It was small, and it was, in a sense, easy to know what was worthwhile and reliable knowledge. What Price argued is that in big science, that was impossible because people didn't know of each other. And the point is that if you see the foreword of the first edition, I took this from the second edition, from a later edition, but the foreword were done by Robert Merton, I already mentioned him, and Eugene Garfield. And Eugene Garfield, for those who don't remember him, was the creator of scientometrics, or the citation index, current contents. And so Price and Garfield created the scientometrics, which is the quantitative measures of scientific quality. Is that clear? If there are questions here, please let me know. But so what you had is this process of transformation from little science to big science, and they not only changed the norms of science, as I showed before, but it also required a more formal system and quantitative system of quality assurance. Are we? If there are questions, please let me know. I don't see you, so let's see. Okay, now coming back to us and post-normal science. What were we doing with Jerry around the late 70s and beginning of the 80s? We were working on quantification in risk analysis or risk assessment, okay? At that time, perhaps for you that are quite young, all risk assessment was about complex technological systems. And almost biohazards, let me put it that way, were just below the radar or below the, it started much later. Okay, so most of the work on quantification of risk or risk assessment, I'll come back to your question, Debbie. So we were talking about the quantification of risks, and we were concentrated at that time in a problem that here is a book from, the book appeared in 87, but the work has been done during the 80s by a colleague of us at the University of Leeds in the UK, and that was Sally McGill. And the work, and as you see, we've contributed to some of the chapters of the book, and it was about a nuclear waste processing plant in Cumbria, in England, Sellafield Windscale. Okay, it's still around. And the question at that time was, if the emissions from Windscale could explain clusters of child leukemia in the area in Cumbria. Okay, is that clear? So that was the idea. And so we started to work with Sally with the UK National Radiological Protection Board in trying to understand trying to give an answer to that scientific question. And what we found is that there were big disagreement and controversies among three groups of experts. One were the modelers that were working on the radiobiological models. The second was the epidemiologists. And the third were the local GPs, the general practitioners, the local doctors, okay? So there was a total disagreement among them. Well, if you think about COVID, you will see that these groups were always also involved in big controversies among them in the case of COVID. So what I'm trying to argue is that at that time, we found out something that people consider a bit surprising, that different groups of experts disagree on an issue that seemed quite simple. I mean, you have emissions from a nuclear power plant, you have clusters of child leukemia. How can you establish with a certain degree of confidence that there is or no a relation between the two situations? Is that clear? Now, we were not surprised. Actually, it's precisely what we were arguing. And this was a good illustration about how scientists disagree on issues in which people think they should agree. And why? Well, let's see. Okay, and I'm coming back to a person I mentioned previously, which coined the term big science, that Erwin Weinberg in 1961. Here is a classic paper by Erwin Weinberg in Minerva, is around early 70s. And for those young people in the audience, well, before the internet, this is what a citation looked like, okay? So I had it since then when I was working in the 80s before the internet. So you had, and that was published by Garfield, as I mentioned previously, okay? So this is, perhaps you are not familiar with this way of introducing citation, but this is how it was. And that was a classic citation, okay? So Erwin Weinberg coined the term trans-science also. And I won't mention, you can look at Erwin Weinberg, but he was quite influential, a physicist working also on the Manhattan Project, but also in Oak Ridge National Laboratories. And he had a problem similar to the problem we had in Windscale, but it was more theoretical. His question was, can we establish a cause-effect relation, or can we say with certain degree of confidence or high reliability that the relation between a nuclear power station working as designed, so we are not talking about accidents like in 3 Mile Island or in Chernobyl, we are talking about a nuclear power station working normally, and environmental or health effects, okay? And his answer is that, no, we can't. And he called that trans science. Now, let me hear more. In general, the definition of trans science was done by the first chair or administrator of American environmental protection, Bill Ruckelshaus, who defined it as a problem that can be expressed scientifically but cannot be solved scientifically. And already Ruckelshaus saw that most of the problems the EPA had to deal with in his terms of office, he was twice head of EPA, were trans-scientific. So problems that could be expressed scientifically but cannot be solved. If we have time and you are interested, we can discuss what does it mean to solve a problem scientifically, but that will take us away. There is Another point here is related to Harvey Brooks, who was an American engineer who actually created the Kennedy School for Government in Harvard University. And when he was in IASA, I don't know if you're familiar, but the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, Harvey Brooks argued that the work on large systems analysis, simulation models, we can call it today, was largely trans-scientific. And Harvey Brooks argued that since the time of Henri Poincaré, we know that these complex systems of differential equations don't have a solution. Anyway, so this was one of the elements that we knew and we worked on around. So the idea that scientists, not only in one discipline, but among disciplines disagree with themselves was consequences of the trans-scientific character of the problem. Second element, which was very important, is the emergence of what it is called popular epidemiology. I don't know if you're familiar. The paradigmatic case of popular epidemiology, it was Love Canal. If you are interested, this is my colleague from University of Bergen, Ragnar Fjelland, who wrote a very nice article on Love Canal and the controversies around the issue, and also about the participation of the community in trying to develop research that was useful for the problem the community had. Today, there is a new interest in this because not only of citizen science and all that type of things, but mainly it's called Undone Science. And by the label of Undone Science is all the research done by communities all over the world to fill the gap of research and knowledge inputs that administrators, politicians, and accredited experts are not interested in. Okay, so these were two elements that enabled us to work our way towards what we called later post-normal science. And now, I think most of you are familiar with the post-normal science, some of the elements. But let me, so Tom or Kati, if you talk too much, I'm going to finish quite soon, but if you want me to stop, just let me know. So first of all, because I've been around many of these conferences and webinars and things like that, and I want to tell you what I believe, and we believe, I can say with Jerry, that post-normal science is not. Okay. The first thing that post-normal science is not a new scientific method. And by a scientific method, it's not a scientific method, it's not a new organon in the sense of Aristotle or Bacon, okay? It is not a new scientific paradigm in the Kuhnian sense, okay? So, and it doesn't aspire, at least this is what we believe, it doesn't aspire to become a new normal. Okay, so we always argue that post-normal science is a number of insights to help in the understanding, framing, and resolution of a certain type of problems. And those type of problems were defined by what we call the mantra. Okay, so I think the mantra is well known, but I will repeat it because there are a couple of ways in which you can interpret these four statements. So the facts are uncertain, the values in dispute, stakes are high, and decisions urgent. Okay, now, as I say, there is a simple way of understanding these statements, and I think all of you that are listening can give examples in the COVID case of the four. You can illustrate with examples, even if you are not experts, how facts are uncertain, how the values, etc., etc. But not only. I can argue that those things you can illustrate with the other human challenges. For example, the climate change, the collapse of ecosystems or biodiversity, and all the sustainability transitions. You can give examples how this is articulated. Okay, so that would be a simple way of understanding the mantra, but there is a more a deeper one, which I will say is subversive and ironic. The first is think about facts uncertain. How can a fact be uncertain? So what in this simple statement, we are questioning the normal construction of facts and implying also a simple idea about what is evidence or factual evidence. Now, the other three, I will go fast, but you see, values, stakes, and decisions were always considered externalities to the scientific endeavor. Okay, so what we are arguing that in this type of scientific or research endeavor, value, stakes, decisions are no longer externalities to the activity of construction of knowledge, but also that the idea that we have to be careful about what we mean by a fact. Okay. The second element or insight that is this heuristic diagram that many of you have seen. And what we have, and I have a collection of hundreds of diagrams like this. So it has shown that it is iconic, but it is also heuristic, and you can do the same, search for the diagram in Google Images and you'll find hundreds. But the interesting thing about this diagram is that we use 2 dimensions. One is called uncertainty and the other stakes in order to talk about quality. Okay, that's the important point. And the other element that you should be aware is that uncertainty and stakes are not independent dimensions. Okay, so why I'm saying that? Because all of you are familiar with this concept of the fabrication of uncertainty or the strategic use of uncertainty. It started with the work on big pharma, tobacco, agrobusiness, where people commissioned research in order to fight regulation. Okay, so the strategic use of uncertainty, but perhaps you are more familiar with Conway and Orestes' book, The Merchant of Doubts, where they argue that the same strategy used in the case of tobacco, big pharma, and agribusiness was used on climate. People did research, or that the argument is in order to use it strategically to fight regulation or actions, political action for change. Now, the important point is that you can argue in this view that when you don't have uncertainty, is because the subject is not very important. As soon as a system is of interest for someone and there are stakes involved, uncertainty will start to emerge. Okay, and we can come back to that later. But the point here, and I'm finishing soon, is what it shows is the idea that the fundamental element is not uncertainty, but it is quality. And we defined quality in a post-normal science as fitness for purpose or fitness for function. Okay? Now, is the idea this, how good is the knowledge input to a purpose that is so political, institutional, socially defined? And that goes back, and if you're interested, I go to ideas about totally quality control, ideas of Edward Demings in industrial and technology quality control, we can talk about later. But in our case, what we say, and this is what I want to state to you, keep with you, is the idea that starting from here for the bottom, you have an extension of the peer community, okay? And this is, just to give you an example, what we call professional consultants. Are the profession, what we call the learned arts, which are, the subject is very interesting in relation to COVID and so on, because when we talk about professions, we talk about engineering, we talk about medicine, we talk about architecture, we talk about veterinary. These professions, these professionals are not scientists. They use science, but not only. And what we see is that in doing their work, there is an extension of the community of that people judging the quality of the work and the knowledge produced, or of the artifacts produced. And the society has already recognized the distinction between science and the professions, you know, in a social contract. And I can come back to that. So what we argue is that when you go up on stakes or in uncertainty, your community of quality assurers is extended, and we call that extended peer communities. Okay. Now, I think this is familiar with you, but the important point is that as soon as you start going up, these extended peer communities are not only about science, but about knowledge. And that's the important point. We started talking about post-normal science as transdisciplinary. It's not simply multidisciplinary or whatever you call it, but transdisciplinary. Trans means, like in the case of trans science, the trans means beyond. So, so what you have is transdisciplinary means beyond the usual division of scientific knowledge into disciplines. So I started by arguing that science doesn't speak with one voice, and I'm almost finished by saying that knowledge doesn't speak only the scientific voice. Okay, so and finally, what I want to say is that all these elements in that we call the mantra, which define a post-normal problem, and as I say, define most of the huge human challenges of today, are not in isolation of a context. And what is the context? What is today's context in which this post-normal science are playing? The first is what we have is an intolerable inequalities in society. The second is weak democratic institutions. The third is authoritarian temptations. And finally, what you have is an economy of scientific and technological promises based on silver bullets. So, in this sense, it's all to be done. And thank you very much. And I'm stop sharing and we can start the conversation.
Okay, so let's start with Nicola. You have raised your hand.
Okay, thank you very much, Silvio. It's for me an invaluable opportunity to have the possibility simply to ask you some questions. And my questions are basically, how do you situate post-normal science with respect to what happened with the Edinburgh School and with Bruno Latour in particular? Because basically, I would be eager to hear from you, for example, how do you situate post-normal science with respect to the concept of flat ontology, which is pushed by Latour, because basically with Latour, science and flat ontology is what allows to call a science a science, you know? And these are two questions. There will be plenty of, but just to add another one, I would like to ask you what do you think we should speak also about post-normal politics? And is post-normal science different from post-normal politics? That's all. Sorry.
Okay. Questions are important, and the first one is quite complex, and I will apologize. We can talk. I think we talked independently sometime, and we exchange mail already, but not on this subject. But I will be happy to do that, because I don't want to. When what we saw is interesting. If you check the citations of post-normal science, usually it comes in three. It comes mode 2, post-normal science, and something else, a triple helix or something like that, and sometimes they mention Latour, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I call that a ritual citation, because these things are very different, even to the wicked problems. Okay, have you heard of the idea, wicked problems? Okay, no, these things are very different, and as I say, it will take me a long time to try to distinguish post-normal science from the other, but or from Sheila Jasanoff's type of citizen science or civic science, I call it, and other people. These are parallel lines. I think what distinguishes post-normal science is our biography. We started as mathematicians, okay? So we started as mathematicians, and we are coming from science. And Debbie asked me the question, are you talking about social sciences? Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. But we come from science, okay? And the trajectory from risk analysis, it shows you from where it comes. We don't come from anthropology or from the social sciences, you know. So at the beginning, and this is why I wanted to show the biography in it. So we concentrated on the question of quality. And I invite you all to check Latour, to check Sheila, to check Mode 2 and the rest. Quality is never mentioned. Or even uncertainty, going deep into the notion of uncertainty, ignorance in knowledge. Okay, so accept this answer for the moment. The second is, remember, our first paper, 93, no, it was not our first. We were already writing paper for more than 10 years. But the 93 paper, Science for the Postnormal Age, it says Science for the Postnormal Age. Okay, so, and for us, if you look at our book in 1990, Uncertainty and Quality in Science for Policy, we argue that we were doing politics. Okay, so we are not ashamed about that or embarrassed. We were doing politics, and we were talking about the democratization of knowledge, and in particular, the democratization of mathematics, you know, which is a centerpiece, not only from Pythagoras, but from Galileo and Descartes. It's a centerpiece of scientism and science reductionism. Okay, so with Jerry, we could do an alternative history of mathematics concentrating on uncertainty, no, starting from even from Pythagoras and talking about the irrationality of square root of 2. Now, so if you want, we can continue this conversation, but I want to give the opportunity to others.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will tap into the conversation regarding how I think there is I mean, there is also this very, I mean, I would not compare immediately post-normal science with the Jasinoff's co-production or things like that, or Latour, because I think this is more. I would rather compare it with some of the more critical schools, and especially in the later development, also with the work of Saltelli and Mario Giampietro, where they are. I mean, so there is really a critical twist, and now we are talking about that science is really in a crisis. So this criticism, I think, is also very predominant here. Okay. Now we have more questions. So first it was Lorenzo, and then you, Jan.
Well, thank you very much, Silvio, for the presentation. I have a question that's mostly for clarification, because, for instance, the EEA has, I think, is been interpreting more and more making use of post-normal science, but very much put in the context of kind of a Kuhnian revolution. So I hear very loud and clear when you say that, but that's not the case. But I mean, so could you just elaborate on that, and so they could fully grasp why that's. Wouldn't be
okay, let's say, and I have to be quite honest with you. From the beginning, we have been quite careful about what we claim. Okay, and especially, as I say, our biography. We have Jerry was a mathematician, very good mathematician actually. And started to work originally in complexity mathematics. He did, and a historian of science, very important one, as perhaps you know, his work on Copernicus. I was a mathematician working on foundations of mathematics and then philosophy of mathematics and all that. So we are very careful with the words that we use. So, coming to your question about the scientific revolution, and what I'm claiming is that, scientific revolution, you cannot assimilate scientific revolution with paradigm. Okay. First, because paradigm is a very ambiguous word. It means many things. Even in Kuhn's little book, I think opponents, let's say, mainly Popperians and positivists, identify 30 different meanings of the word paradigm in Kuhn's work. It doesn't matter because it's heuristically very important. But if you say this is a paradigm and you can think of many, well, post-normal science is not that as such. but it may constitute part of a scientific revolution in the Kuhnian sense, because it is part of, as Tom mentioned before, the struggle for critical reasoning, for hybridization of knowledges, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the question, David, about social sciences. Well, social scientists were the first to, well, that was a question from David in the chat, so perhaps you are not. So if I'm talking also about social science, well, I could talk about social sciences, you see, because most in a certain time, and precisely after Kuhn's book in '62, became quantitative, like geography, like sociology, like even anthropology, and so on and so forth. And they almost destroyed themselves in the effort, okay? And so they say, well, we have a paradigm, we are real science. Okay, that was the argument. We are a Kuhnian discipline, okay? So I don't know if I'm starting to answer your question, but it is important that for us, we already had a lot of people against us, okay? So we were not going to start claiming that you need a extended peer community to determine the laws of thermodynamics, okay? So you know what I mean. The other thing is we had to fight against the people who say you are not talking about, you don't believe in expertise. That is also nonsense. I mean, we recognize that in order to do a brain or heart operation, you have to have some kind of skill and expertise, okay? So it's not, but the thing is, what is the context in which, of this, or the scope of validity of your skill and expertise? So I think this is an important. Just by the way, during the 30s in Vienna, there was something that was called the Vienna Circle. Okay, perhaps some of you will remember the name, and that was Carnap and Otto Neurath and so on had an idea about what science was. Okay, and there was an important group, and actually from the political point of view, they were on the left. They were scientific, but at the same time they were on the left, which is something interesting to discuss another time. But the fact is, they define science as a statement that has a meaning, okay? So meaning was their criteria to define science. Why? Because they argue they were fighting against the church and theology. So they argue that theology was meaningless. And in order to define what meaning means, Carnap tried to create a logical scientific language that was unambiguous and independent from the ordinary language, okay? So that's the origin of the whole discussion. So one of the members of the Vienna Circle in Vienna, Otto Neurath, talked then about the orchestration of sciences. And by that means orchestration of disciplines, and their publication was called the Encyclopedia of the Unification of the Science Unity or Science Unification. I cannot recall. But what's interesting is that they were the ones who published Kuhn's book in '62. Now, Popper, on the other hand, say, oh, you're talking nonsense. Science cannot be defined by meaning, okay? By semantics, okay? He said what distinguishes science from non-science, and that was the argument, is is empirical content. Because Popper, and as I mentioned before, identifying science with liberal democracy was not fighting the church. He was fighting, like Merton, he was fighting Stalinism, he was fighting German idea of German physics against Jewish physics, and he was fighting against psychoanalysis. And he argued that those things didn't have empirical content because whatever you infer from them, you always are inside the theory. So you cannot refute the theory. So in that sense, they didn't have. So those were the ideological commitments that we are creating a certain form of identifying what is science and what is not. Okay, so what I'm trying to say that the revolution today, I don't know if Kuhnian or no, is not to an orchestration of sciences or disciplines, but a choreography of knowledges. And I always, you know, you heard me about this term perhaps before, the argument today is not like the IPCC, okay? It's like the IPBES, you know? So our challenge is how do we establish a choreography of knowledges, because we will need them all in order to face challenges. That is not only COVID, it's also a war in Central Europe.
Okay, so Debbie, is this your question? Is that for this discussion here? Then I will let you in, and then you over to you, Jan, afterwards.
But this is a perfect entry point into my question, I feel. This orchestration of voices, because I wanted to ask about your initial question, the normative question, should science speak with one voice? Now, I feel it quite clear that the answer to can it is actually no. But maybe I misunderstood the actual position of post-normal sciences, or maybe I have to understand positions of individual people promoting it to understand the question. But what is the answer actually on the should question? Should it? And then my thought is, would the approach be that through this orchestration of voices, like a kind of alignment so that it becomes possible, and that should be the actual goal? I also want to ask this because I know many scientists, and with this I mean chemists, physicists, mostly academic scientists, who say it is not necessary. I do what I'm good at. And when something is at stake, there will be other people doing that. So that means the post-normal approach is, no, we have to convince people that it needs this alignment of voices, and this then looks like one voice.
Okay, this is again a complex question. Now, science, I think we agree that science cannot speak with one voice, okay? And even individual disciplines, if they understood in complex terms. Okay, so the idea of should is a totally different level of question. And for example, IPCC thinks that they should. And in order to do that, they establish a consensus statement because they believe science should speak with one voice in order to have influence, a political influence. Let me put it that way. So the question is should. Now, our position is, well, COVID. Should science have spoken with one voice? And in that case, it's clear, not only couldn't, but people thought it shouldn't. Right. And in a way, COVID or the future pandemics and all the other problems that biodiversity and so on have the same importance as a human challenge. So why, in the case of climate, scientists talk about consensus and the fact that in order to have influence, you have to speak with one voice, whereas in all the other problems, we accept the complexity, meaning the ambiguity, the plurality of perspective and actions. So, and that is a cultural, it's a political, it's an administrative, it's a constitutional, institutional question, which I would be happy to discuss. Now, there is the last point you mentioned, which I think it's important, is, okay, let's the scientists in their laboratories do their work, okay? I'm not asking them to be post-normal. But if someone working on genetics, reproduction genetics, CRISPR, says, oh, today I wake up and I'm going to impregnate and change and have babies produced by genetical modification. I say, stop. Okay. So when you go to the fancy science and technology or techno-scientific endeavors, you're no longer in your traditional laboratory science. Okay. And I can give you examples, but it's not only in the new biology that we are talking, because that impinges clearly in questions of what we are, not only as individuals, but as a species, as part of, the world. But today I can be less careful I was 40 years ago. First, because I'm old enough to say I don't give a damn. But, if you're talking about fundamental physics today, you see, do we live in the multi-level, dimensional, whatever, that has as a mathematical expression a string theory, which is very debatable, and so on and so forth. So when we go in biology, or even in chemistry, we go to the very small, and in physics, we are perhaps in a post-normal situation. You see? So I could argue that in order to determine if we are going to allow human genetic modifications or things of that type, well, an extended peer communities are necessary, and surely science should not speak with one voice.
Thank you. Okay, Debbie, over to you.
Thank you. First of all, as an Argentinian, Silvio, I'm very honored to be here. You're one of the Argentinians I admire the most. My question is, you talked about the ethos of science for Merton and others. In post-normal situations, what would you say is or should be the ethos of science?
I think that's a difficult question, and I will tell you why. Not because I don't want to answer, but mainly because if you look around, and I think I can speak about me and Jerry, no? And we have certain ideas that are not necessarily shared by what we can call the extended post-normal community. Okay, so, but we never try to impose a certain type of true interpretation of post-normal science, because we are not like that. And if you are interested, we can talk about, I don't believe in strict definitions. I love ambiguity and vagueness, because for us, it's what enables communication. Okay, so always said as a joke that, as a joke, we said that all our conversation of more than 40 years with Jerry is a total misunderstanding. And this is why it was created. He was saying something, but coming from Philadelphia, in the 30s, I was coming from Almagro in Buenos Aires, although we study the same thing, we use words with different meanings. So, so this is how it is. It's the construction of a dialogue, a construction of knowledge. So I'm in favor. So when I said, as far as I'm concerned, or Jerry is concerned, for us the important thing is to have a critical mind, okay, and to be humble. Okay, so the main features are humility and have some dignity and respect for the others. Okay, because this is something that's missing a lot. Respect, the recognition that they are others. Okay, and we can today is quite difficult to talk about that. We have conspiracy theories. We have war. We have all those type of challenges. And some people that were with us at the beginning in post-normal science, and they published on post-normal science, say, oh, you are giving legitimacy to those nasties. Okay. And so my question, so they are questioning the inclusionary or the plurality, the diversity, and the legitimacy we give to all those other voices. I think they might be right, I don't know, but let me say why I disagree, okay, with respect. I disagree because the problem is not one of inclusion, it's one of exclusion. So my question is, how do you exclude people who want to participate, even if you don't like them, even if you hate them, even if they disgust you? What are the means we can use to stop them participating? Okay. So that's the problem from a moral and political philosophy point of view. I think Tom is expert on ethics. And tell you, problem is exclusion. How do you define who is in and how is out? And if those who you deem should be out or shouldn't have a voice want to participate, you kill them? What do you do? So,
but it's the paradox
it's a political philosophical problem that has to be constructed. So the ethos of this new way of looking at things, and it is not new, I can show you historically, it's not new, it's all to be constructed.
Yes, we still have like 10 minutes or so left. So if you have any comments, then please raise your hand. I will then use the opportunity just to say a few things that I thought of during these very interesting questions and this talk. So first of all, if we agree that the science do not speak with one voice and that there is disagreement, then I think the next question is not, well, should they try to agree and establish consensus? I think rather the thing to ask next would be, okay, then how can we live with or how can we manage this disagreement in a, well, reflexive or civilized or something like that manner? And I think that I think is kind of also a normative assumption embedded within post-normal science, and quite unique actually. How do we live with this disagreement? So Silvio, you also mentioned last time that you are becoming more interested in disagreement, and if we look at the post-normal science diagram, it's I mean, it's in this one liner here. It's the values that are in dispute, but so much more is actually in dispute. Yeah. So that's a key word for you then.
Well, I've been involved, and we have been involved in a lot of discussions about arguing against consensus. We are always been against consensus. It doesn't mean that we are against negotiations and agreements. But the difference between a consensus and a negotiation in good faith or whatever is that you know what you're giving in order to obtain something else. Okay, so it is a conscious argument about a kind of transaction in relation to an objective. Now, as Tom says, this is quite a crucial problem today, because if you look around, you will see that there is polarization, there is a fragmentation, and very difficult to establish quality in the sense of post-normal science, because you have to create a process in order to establish a shared purpose, also identify what is the problem that we are trying to solve, and what are the instruments that we are going to use in order to do that. Okay, having but the fact that it is unthinkable for us, or we think it's very difficult, it doesn't mean that it's not possible. And remember, if I was going to tell you in 2019 that there will be a COVID epidemic of a global scale, followed by a war in Central Europe, you say, come on, you must be joking. Lorenzo and Anna, that I've been looking at foresight and all the, find me where, yes, but it was. So we are dealing with now with irreversible discontinuity. This is what I believe, but it's not a statement of fact. It's a statement of belief. I believe that we are living an irreversible, and think about and your work, Lorenzo, Anna, etc., because you are on a kind of a knowledge distribution agency in order to support policies. Okay, this becomes more difficult today than yesterday, in the sense that we might find ourselves that some of what we called an agency called the challenges, the big challenges, have changed and will change. So precisely that's the issue. And just for the question that Nicola, perhaps he didn't ask, but he will be interested. When Habermas, after the Second World War, proposed this idea of rational communication, or communication rationality, I think that he didn't really believe in that, but he had to believe after the Second World War and the Shoah and the disaster war in Europe. So we have to believe that it is possible to do these things. And from a more practical point of view, I think it's great because it's all to be done. When I was young in Argentina and I was active politically, from the left, we always say the famous phrase was, what is to be done? And I think today the question is, how is it to be done? What is no longer so important?
Thanks. Anna, I will give you the final question remark, and then I will see if there are reactions to that, most likely also from Silvio. So please.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for this talk and interesting discussion. I mean, what comes to me is what you said. We are in a context of inequality, weak democratic institutions, authoritarian temptations, etc., where polarization and fragmentation make it very difficult to establish the quality sense of post-normal science. So it's it makes it very difficult to extend this peer knowledge community and to, so how do we navigate this in this context, which is increasingly harsher and making it more difficult for this to take place? Thank you.
I think it's a great question, and sorry, I forgot. I was going to say something about this, but I forgot. I think that the key is humility, and I think what we have to, and Tom hinted, I was more interested now in conflict than in, we have to start with illustration projects, activities. And I'm not talking about scientific projects. I'm talking about real projects. And I would like to, for you, instead of having said what I said, no, in an intellectual audience, I would like to have started with examples of post-normal science in action in India, in South Africa, and Latin America, okay? So this is for me how it is to be done. And as I say in Italian, if they're they will flower, you know, if they're flower, they will flower, or whatever, they will blossom, right? Is it Lorenzo, Maddalena? If they are flower, they will blossom. All the other things are is a product of hubris. You see, today we have to start showing that it can be done at small illustration projects to do what I called before undone science, okay? And meaning trying to participate with communities in their everyday struggle in order to do research and science that will be good for the communities and for the people and for the environment. This is how I see it. And again, you can always say that I'm not very ambitious, and well, that's okay also, but that's the only way. And I'm collaborating now with some people in Argentina and on what Joan Martinez-Salier, my good friend, initiated, which is the Environmental Justice Atlas, where the hundreds, thousands of cases of conflicts in the world done by communities. And well, we start from there. We start and looking why certain conflicts can be resolved and some others not. So we start working on practice, trying to solve real problems by real people, okay? Creating appropriate knowledge at the appropriate level, okay? And that is a big cultural shift. You see, that's a big cultural shift. And that is a revolution. It's a revolution from the aims of and goals of modernity. Let's think, and I say post-normal science is about responsible anticipation. And it is not about prediction and control. So let's agree that it is futile prediction and control. We are not controlling anything, okay? And I suppose that the success of conspiracy theories is that because in all conspiracy theories, someone or something is in control. And so the way to do it is to recognize, okay, this is how life is. We try to do our best and live with some dignity. And and trying to avoid violence and trying to respect the other. And if we are successful, we'll survive.
Thank you very much, Silvio, and also I would like to thank everyone here for joining.
If I can do some advertising, can you let me share?
Yes,
for the Italian speakers. Okay, let me. Yeah, this. Okay. So if you're those Italian speakers, if you are interested, we are having a webinar, a project called Bridges with my 3 good friends here, Alice Venezia, Chiara Scaramella, and Alba Lastorina, where we talk about discontinuities and hybridization in life and research. Thank you.
Great. So with this advertisement, then I think we should thank you once again, Silvio, for this very interesting presentation and also very good discussions that we had. It was really a pleasure. As you can see, it's recorded. So Christos, my co-worker, will turn it into a video, so it is also available for those who are not here, and you can also use it to remember what was discussed.
Tom, all of you, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Silvio.